Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Protecting Your LGBTQ Plus Clients, Best Practices from Industry Experts. I'm Ashley Meekum, she, her, a member of the Diversity Key Committee for Oregon Realtors. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. So first, CE is being tracked based on your Zoom login, which means if you're watching this as a group or with a friend, only the person who is registered in Zoom will receive CE. So when you join the webinar, you are asked for your name, email, and your M1 number. We will use that to process your CE. If you put in a fake name or you didn't use your M1 number, we won't be able to get you your CE. If you have questions, please send Oregon Realtors Education a message in the chat. You will be emailed instructions for accessing your certificate within 2 weeks. We'll be watching the chat throughout the presentation, so please feel free to post any questions within the chat or in the Q&A. However, we ask you to keep your questions respectful and relevant. Anyone who does not engage in the chat or in this webinar with a spirit of learning and best intent will be removed from the webinar without receiving CE credit. With that, I am excited to introduce our two presenters, Percy Wise, he, him, loan officer from Two Rivers Mortgage, and Alexa Lockman, she, they, president of the Oregon LGBTQ Plus Real Estate Alliance and broker with Keller Williams Realty Professionals. Alexa and Percy, welcome.
Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, okay, let's get started with a few questions. So the this is typed wrong, sorry. The LGBTQ Plus Real Estate Alliance just posted their new study stating that according to Gallup, almost 20% of Gen Z are identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community, and Oregon has the second highest population of LGBTQ plus folks in the country at 5.6%. Why do you think that is, and have you noticed an increase in buyers who identify as part of the community?
Well, I'll just start that off a little bit. I think one thing to be aware of, and first of all, I will say that the LGBTQ Plus Real Estate Alliance is a national group. We've just formed the Oregon chapter here. And the national group has a wonderful website with a lot of resources on it. So feel free to explore that after today's webinar. They're doing an excellent job partnering with other industry groups, such as Freddie Mac, other large industry groups that are able to kind of create and formulate research on the LGBTQ plus communities, specifically as it relates to housing and our industry. And so one of the things that Freddie Mac and the Alliance have identified is that there's a huge portion of the LGBT community does not live in the same place where they grew up, right? So we have a very high rate of mobility around the country. And in fact, 73% of boomers, of people from the boomer generation who are LGBTQ, do not live in the place where they grew up. And there's a lot of different reasons why people choose to leave their communities, but very high on that list is need and desire to live in places that are more LGBTQ friendly, right? So if you grow up in a place where you're not accepted, where you feel endangered, or just simply not included in aspects of the community, such as economic life, job opportunities, environment, ability to find a relationship, and pursue educational and college activities, you're going to be more likely to move, or sometimes to flee, as I sometimes term it. And that's in fact what happened to me. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, and I was, in high school, and I was not feeling safe in my community. It was the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic when I was in high school. And so I scrounged together, I worked a job, and I scrounged together enough money to leave, and I went, west, right? And so that's kind of what we're seeing, is that people are going to communities where they feel safe. And Oregon has a very good policy climate, particularly right now for LGBTQ folks. We have non-discrimination laws that protect people. We have healthcare laws and policies that, enable folks, transgender folks such as myself, to access healthcare. And, we had some early on protections for civil unions before same-sex marriage was passed by the Supreme Court and by the federal courts. I don't know if you have something you'd like to
I do.
add, Alexa.
Yeah, so Oregon is also one of the 22 US jurisdictions that allows legal gender to be recognized as non-binary. So if you are gender queer, gender non-conforming, this is a place where you can legally have that designated on your identification, which is a huge draw when you're trying to live your life in a way where you are legally recognized as neither male nor female. And I think interestingly enough, like, what part of this question is like, are we experiencing an influx of LGBTQ plus buyers in the community? It's like, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think I'm experiencing more than I usually do, because I think that that's kind of like who I attract and who I work with. But I would say to the average Oregon realtor, this is a population that increasingly is going to show up as a client that you're going to have to serve. And so having some basic skills of, what people are experiencing as they come here, whether they're fleeing/migrating, or whether they're just coming to enjoy all that Oregon has to offer, there are certain skills that you do need to develop as this population increases, because the likelihood that you will serve someone who is part of this community is pretty real as we step into this new reality where so many of Gen Z are identifying as LGBTQ plus.
Yeah, and I will just add to that, that as people come to find greater stability, in our lives, because of the protections that we have, that stability tends to the conditions where people want to put down homeownership roots, right? So there have been studies showing that, the economic impact of same-sex marriage becoming legalized throughout the nation is a very positive economic impact. And it's showing that people who are able to access same-sex marriage, they feel a greater amount of stability and a greater tendency to work towards family creation, right? And so the more people feel that, the more they are going to want to become homeowners. And what the Alliance report is showing is that particularly family formation, becoming parents, helps drive LGBT homeownership. So if we take a step back and we look at, overall the community demographics, it's important to recognize that LGBTQ people have a huge disparities in homeownership. So meaning that, we own a lot less homes than people that are not LGBTQ. And the statistic is that about 64%, 2/3 of the general population are homeowners, right? In the United States, there's a huge amount of people in the United States who are homeowners. But when it comes to the LGBT population, that number drops to less than 50% of LGBT folks are homeowners, right? And so, for instance, for the transgender population, somewhere between only 16 and 33% of transgender people own their own home, compared to that 2/3 number of the general population. But I think one of the things that's really fascinating to recognize is that that number, LGBT people who have children who are homeowners, it's the same number, 64%, right? So it's that kind of impetus on creating stability in people's lives, ability to create family, that is leading to more people being ready to buy homes. And certainly a lot more of, we see across the board, a lot more of the millennial generation is stepping in. It's like this huge group of people stepping in to buy homes that we hear. Ashley, you're smiling, maybe you're familiar with that, but that you see kind of stepping in. And also it's 90%. So 90% of LGBT folks who are not parents say they would want to own a home if they had children. So this whole push towards, policy stability, laws that are more protective of people, those have very positive economic impacts in our communities.
Okay. We had one question back to one of the statistics that you gave, Percy. Jen asked, was this statistic, I can say that word on a normal day, I swear. 70% of LGBTQ plus don't live in their place of origin?
So the statistic is that 73% of people from the boomer generation don't live in the place that they went to high school in. For Gen X, like I'm Gen X, right? So Gen X, 67% have moved. It's a little bit lower for millennials, but not hugely lower. 63% of LGBTQ millennials live in a different location from where they went to high school. Yeah.
Okay. I have a personal follow-up or just a question that came to me. So while we're going, do you think that the reason the numbers that you gave for trans people varies so much because there's less of that community that openly identifies as trans?
No, so what's driving that is that if you look at LGBTQ economics, right? If you look at what's our financial condition, the LGBTQ community has a higher poverty rate than the non-LGBT community. And I'm sorry, I'm not projecting it, but I'm looking at a slide here that shows that, poverty rate for non-LGBTQ people is somewhere between 10 and 15%. Excuse me, somewhere between 15 and 20%, but the poverty rate is much higher for LGBTQ folks. When you start to look at the transgender community, the general population is 12% poverty rate as of, I'm looking at data from 2015. So that the general population has a 12% poverty rate, but for the Oregon transgender community, it jumps, it's a 30% poverty rate, right? So we're experiencing more dire economic conditions than the rest of the community. And trans people are experiencing higher levels of homelessness and housing displacement than the rest of the community. So when you look across the board, you see those economic impacts to trans folks of things like unemployment, housing stability, job loss. They're more severe for the trans folks than for lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks, right? And so that's kind of what is driving that.
And that's where, for me, just sort of anecdotally, as a realtor, when you're working with different populations, even within the LGBTQ plus community, there are going to be different levels of sort of scaffolding that you have to do based on the reality of what certain populations have experienced and also the access that they have to information. So one of the things that the Alliance report in 2023 put out also was just this idea that in the LGBTQ community, there is a kind of a perpetuating belief that saving for a down payment is difficult / impossible, or that home prices are beyond reach. But I think a lot of that also has to do with, and then, our experience is that a lot of times when we sit down with these people and we go through the normal things that we do in our jobs, it isn't necessarily that much less attainable. It's just access to information, and information that is been tailored to a certain population so that they can receive that information. I mean, even when you think about what advertising looks like for most sort of, loan programs or whatever, it's like that may not be the same, someone may not identify with the image of family that's being shown there, and it may not feel like it applies to them, even if it does. And so it's not necessarily harder work to work with this population, but there are sort of some ways in which you kind of scaffold to provide that equity, since there are these disparities that are kind of like inherent to the identity. And yes, I see in the chat that yes, Percy does have some amazing statistics that maybe he'd be willing to share with people after the presentation. But
yeah,
also,
and I would just reiterate that those are available on the Alliance website on the housing reports that we're referring to.
Yeah. I think Erica just linked that report. So
Oh, great. Thank you, Erica.
Yeah. They're also usually very good at sending out information afterwards. So, okay. So next we are going to talk about the Human Rights Campaign recently declared its first ever state of emergency for LGBTQ plus Americans earlier this month due to anti-LGBTQ plus legislation that has been sweeping the nation. Do you feel this is impacting clients and also agents in Oregon?
Absolutely. I mean, for those of us who are used to doing a lot of relocation clients, we're seeing an uptick in LGBTQ, specifically transgender migration, due to safety issues. And just anecdotally talking to people who are members in the Alliance, we're seeing a lot of people starting to kind of like reach out to build those networks to get from Missouri, Florida, Oklahoma, places where there are a large amount of anti-trans bills on the docket. And a lot of that has to do with protecting families, right? Protecting family units. So as Percy mentioned, families and housing tend to go together. People are more interested in really setting down the roots of home ownership when they have that family unit. And there are a lot of adults who identify as LGBTQ plus who now cannot really talk about their parenting experience in a public forum, like for instance, at a school, for instance, in Florida. And, that makes things really difficult when you have to sort of hide who you are in public, but then your kids have to come home and you have to explain to them that it's still, okay or acceptable, that, you're not like everybody else, but you're not allowed to talk about it. So a lot of people are trying to just move to places where there aren't as stringent, like where they can talk about what kind of family they are, openly, and where their kids can be comfortable with that. And then of course, a lot of people wanting to move to protect their children from anti-trans bills themselves. Didn't you say when we talked yesterday that there are now like 490 anti-LGBT?
Yeah, so what has happened nationally, if we look at kind of the historical context, is that there are only 21 states in the US that have non-discrimination laws on the books that protect LGBTQ folks, right? And so what we saw, from the 90s leading up into the early 2000s was the move to legalize same-sex marriage and to enhance those protections. It's things like, can you be fired, from your place of employment for being LGBTQ? Can you legally form a family, right? And so we saw same-sex marriage pass through the Supreme Court. We've also seen some protections passed, extending the legal case is not extending what Congress had said, but showing that Congress had intended to protect people's rights in passing things like the Fair Housing Act, for instance, right? And so the Supreme Court coming out with some decisions stating that some of pre-existing federal policies, such as Title IX, Title VII, Federal Fair Housing Act, broadly cover LGBTQ people from discrimination. And so what we tend to see in our communities, we see periods where our rights are being more covered, can't be discriminated against or harmed. And then we see backlashes coming to those advancements, right? And so right now, we're in a very significant period of a backlash nationally against the formation of LGBTQ rights. And so we have seen over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced, not on the national level, but on state by state level around the country. And about 10% of those bills have passed. Okay, and so what those bills are doing is they're kind of broadly trying to reinstitute various types of discrimination against components of LGBTQ community. So examples of what the various states' bills are attempting to do are attempting to restrict the ability of transgender people to access healthcare. And some of those bills are trying to restrict that ability for youth, and others are trying to restrict that ability even for adults. They are not recognizing the fact that when transgender youth are seeking healthcare for their gender identities, that the healthcare that they are receiving is very comprehensively conforming to standards of care that the medical professionals are developing. And across the board, all of the medical associations around the US are forming appropriate standards of care to protect kids and to protect youth when they need to access care. But what the state laws are trying to do is they are attempting to criminalize that access to health care that the medical profession has said should follow a certain protocol, right? And so they're trying to also remove LGBTQ information and basic sex education from schools. They're trying to ban sports participation for certain kids who are trans kids. Some of the bills are requiring teachers to simultaneously not talk about anything related to sexual orientation or gender identity, but to tell, to out kids if they have any expression of that, and to out them to their parents, which can create a lot of lack of safety for children. And they're trying to do a lot of, I've heard of all the bans against drag performers, which in a way are just attempting to remove transgender people from the public sphere. Okay, so for example, if you pass a law saying, you cannot have a drag performance, which is drag is simply like somebody dressing up in a different gender of clothing, right? There's nothing sexual about it. It's just a different expression of gender. So some of the state laws are attempting to say, well, you can't have drag performances in public because a child might see that as if there's something wrong with having a cross-gender, presentation. But those become excuses, right? Those become excuses to try to remove people who are not performers, who are just transgender performers going about their lives, to remove us from public places. So, for instance, there was a transgender woman who is a historian. I believe this was in Missouri, and she had a talk, a history talk, not a drag talk, not a queer talk, not a LGBT focused talk. She was going to give a talk on history at her local library. And the library became afraid that one of these laws was somehow going to apply to her speaking in public as a transgender woman. And they canceled her talk.
Yeah.
Okay. It was a history talk. I think it was a Native American history talk. And so some of these laws are just kind of excuses of how can we remove queer LGBTQ people from the public. And what that does is it leads to an increase in conditions that can create hate crimes and incite violence and harassment against the LGBTQ community, right? So that's kind of the landscape that we are seeing. And here in Oregon, we have seen at least 7 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in the Oregon legislature. And I think as somebody who, I'm a non-practicing attorney, I'm a graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School, right? So somebody who has studied law, I think a lot of what's most alarming to me about these different legislative bills that are being passed in various states is that ultimately these laws are not legal laws, okay? If you look at our federal laws, right, and what they require of us in terms of how we treat one another with dignity and respect in our society, there are base laws in our laws about how we have to treat people equally and fairly, and we cannot act with animus towards any one group, right? But these various state laws are being enacted without any deference to that, right? Which means that ultimately those laws are not really legal because they will be overturned in court. So to me, it's like, why would you, it's like a head scratcher. Why would you pass a law that's not really legal? It's a way of harassing our community, is what it is.
And I think that like that is what is palpable to me in my business currently is sort of, yeah, there are these bills on the docket. There are these things that are masquerading as law, and I'm not an attorney by any means, but what it does is it affects the social climate in a very particular way. And in the last year, the amount of fear that I've seen, both from clients of mine going to areas, especially outside of the Portland area to look at homes, has been palpable. And the other thing too that I've noticed is allies who usually seemed to be very vocal or at least on board, becoming much more reticent to take a side because they themselves, especially if they are in real estate, fear retaliation and don't want to alienate a certain population. And so you start to hear these interesting phrases like, well, I'll work with anybody. But then when you actually start to press on like, well, what does that mean? It means I'm not going to stick up for anybody. I'm not going to stick out my neck for anybody. I'll work with anybody because we're all human, but I'm not going to invest in your particular situation right now or understand your particular point of view. And my pushback to that as a realtor is baloney. That's not your job. Your job, I mean, why do we have all these stories about, oh, I got a single mom into her first home? It's the same thing. We invest in the relationship with that particular client. We try to understand what they're going through in this particular climate. We know as a society that single moms have it hard, so we're okay with that narrative. Why are we not okay with the narrative that makes people more uncomfortable, right? So why are we not investing in the narrative of, you know, transgender home ownership is extremely low. There are a lot of disparities. So I'm going to work harder to help this population receive, you know, the access to education and housing that they need to get there. And so my, you know, sort of my thing is like, if you look at your client base and your clients are all the same, you're doing something wrong. It doesn't matter what demographic you're serving. You're actually not serving everybody. If your clients are all of the same socioeconomic group, they're all of the same race, they're all of the same, you know what I mean? I get that we get to choose our clients, but if you're actually really talking about like making a difference in terms of like access to housing, fair housing and advocacy, like if you're attracting exactly the same client, then you are also not attracting large portions of other populations. And you might want to just reconsider like who you're serving and why.
Yeah, and I would say sometimes it takes a little bit extra, right?
It does.
It takes a little bit extra to attend a webinar like this. And thank you so much to all of you who are attending today. And it takes extra to take the risk of or a perceived risk of what if I make a mistake. And so I think if I would have one takeaway message for the attendees today, it's like, don't let the mistakes get in your way. Don't let the fear of mistakes get in your way of serving more diverse communities.
Absolutely. And also know that these are people who are in your industry too. We have so many people in our industry who identify as LGBTQ plus. And I will say this as my personal experience of being a realtor for a relatively short amount of time. I closeted myself when I first came into this industry because I didn't know where it was going to be appropriate for me to show up as myself. And the more I started realizing that the clients that I sort of resonate with are, peripheral in a lot of ways, like me in a lot of ways, don't have access to the education or knowledge base that they need to sort of make that step to home ownership, the more I started to realize like, oh, it's important for me to show up as myself. But even for me, as someone who identifies as queer, it was very difficult to find other people in different industries. Like I had to consciously look for queer home inspectors. I had to, find through word of mouth and by connecting with other people, people who were out in the mortgage field, et cetera. And it's not, again, it's like anything you do, you get criticism. A lot of people are like, well, why are you building like this pipeline? Shouldn't you be working with everyone? And it's like, yes, but do you know what it's like to work in an industry where it is predominantly heteronormative, cisgendered? It's very difficult to live in that reality every single day, especially when your lived experience is very different. And so having other people who come from similar kinds of experiences, who maybe have a little bit more of that lens through which they can receive clients and cater to their needs is very, very helpful. So if you haven't connected with professionals who are not cisgender heteronormative individuals, you might again connect with us to find other places where you can just build your base of who you have in your network. And I say that to everyone. I mean, I say that to gay men too. A lot of times, it's like we get so stuck in our own community that we're like, well, I work with all these gay men. And it's like, well, but if you're a gay man and you're working only with gay men, then again, where do you need to kind of step out of your comfort zone? Where could you maybe understand a different perspective?
Yeah, I think a couple of people said, it's really important for people to understand housing is for all. And
Yeah.
it's so true that we just need to be able to, we do all tend to attract people who are like us. It's kind of how it goes, unless you really try to step outside of that. That's a conscious effort that everybody has to take, just as kind of a human base, to try to understand other people's lived experience.
And also, I just like to all the realtors out there, allies matter now more than ever before. And I'm sure all of you are in Facebook groups with other realtors, and you see the things that happen when RMLS changes its little logo to a rainbow for 1 month. It's like, I'm not saying become an internet warrior. I don't engage in that stuff myself, but we all hear those comments that people in our industry make, where they're assuming that we all feel a certain way about certain things. And I would urge you just not to let those things go, because when you don't assert your opinion or challenge someone else when they're making a bigoted comment or even a bigoted implication, they're assuming that you think like them. And the more you can lovingly point out to people who know you with your reputation and your work ethic that that's not how you think and that that's not what you want for this industry, the more it's going to change. Because if you just let the status quo be, then we're never going to have more LGBTQ plus people in our industry. And that is going to have a trickle down effect to who accesses housing because of the perspective that's necessary.
All right. We had a question for tips to reach out to LGBTQ
Oh man,
plus
I have a running
inspectors,
list. I will
lenders,
happily share it.
I know.
But that's
Yeah,
one of the
we're
I'm like,
reasons.
Alexa, can you send me your list? Thanks.
Yes,
Yeah,
I think
so
one
I'll
of the reasons
say-
why we're doing this whole Oregon Alliance thing too is because we want people to be able to share those resources. And so if this is something that you feel like you'd really like to engage with more, you know, I would definitely consider joining us. We are relatively new and we're very energetic about, you know, creating fair housing and home ownership for our community, but also working intersectionally with other affinity groups and also recognizing that identities are inherently intersectional. And so, yeah, it's like, you know, I think sharing those resources is awesome. And I will definitely post them on our Instagram page. So
yes, and we're also going to get into some inclusive practices here in a minute. I think in terms of, you know, what are the barriers that kind of the community are seeing? I you know, I want to point out that one of the repercussions of this LGBTQ, why it's being called a state of emergency, like a serious state of emergency. It's not status quo discrimination, is that a lot of the folks that have been living or grew up in the states where these anti-LGBTQ bills are being passed, you know, Florida, Missouri, Arkansas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that people are not, Texas, you know, other places like that, LGBTQ people, particularly trans people, feel that they cannot continue to live there, okay? And so we're seeing actual on the ground transmigration of people leaving those states in kind of a quasi refugee status. And, you know, one of the things I did is I went and I looked at GoFundMe. A lot of people are putting GoFundMe campaigns to try to leave the states where they lived, you know, where they grew up. And so I have personally been contacted by a couple of different clients from Florida, people seeking to move here to Oregon to get into a more, sorry, I have some planes going overhead here, but to get into a more safe place to live, right? And so one of the things that we can do, it's like, yes, there's inclusive practices, but it's like learning more about the LGBTQ community and competencies so that we can talk to people respectfully. And, you know, I do trainings all the time about how to work with people, like more like tangible, you know, what to do, what not to do trainings. I'm happy to do those trainings at brokerages. We're going to be doing more trainings too as part of our Alliance chapter. But what has happened on a state level is that different states have been passing sanctuary state laws so that people will have a greater ability to be safe when they come to a place like Oregon. So we have a law like that right now moving through the legislature that will be passed soon. But what happens is when people get to this place of safety, there are these barriers, right, to home ownership. Like, even though somebody is safe, they might not realize that that's a moment where they can buy a home. And the biggest one is a fear of discrimination, right? Like a huge chunk of LGBTQ people are just afraid of walking through our doors, right? They're afraid that we will discriminate against them. Okay, as far as I know, I'm the only out transgender mortgage broker in Oregon. But a lot of times, and you know, the trans population is like 1.4% of the overall population, right? So most of my clients are not trans, just based on the breakdown of population, right? But even though I'm like the trans mortgage professional, I still sense a lot of times that when trans clients come to me, they're still afraid of what I'm going to say, even though I'm part of their community. And so we have a lot of extra work that we need to do to build up trust with people and to show people that we can be trusted and to kind of, walk the talk, right? People have a real lack of understanding of what the home buying process is going to look like. So home buyer education, like I spend at least 45 minutes to an hour with each of my clients, explaining how the mortgage process works. I don't just send out a pre-approval letter and say, you're good to go, right? I want to meet my clients and talk to them about what they're doing and what they want their budget to look like and all of that good stuff. I think Alexa mentioned earlier on, there's a huge misunderstanding about how much down payment do you need to have to buy a house. And that's part of this Freddie Mac research on the LGBTQ community is a lot of people still think they need 20% or more down payment, right? And so as an industry, we just need to do a much better job of getting the word out that we are here to help people and what that process is going to look like. Because so many times I have people come to me who in their minds, they think they can't do it because all this past discrimination and fear, it leads them to believe that home ownership is not for them, right? But as soon as I can actually look at their real situation, a lot of folks are in a great position to buy a home and they don't know it because they haven't been helped yet.
Yeah, I would also add, like, I've had a couple of particular circumstances where during the process, someone has made an assumption. And in this case, sorry, I have a very old geriatric cat who is deaf and meowing in the background, and there's not a whole lot I can do about it. I had a situation with a queer couple who had a very complicated family history, and I, with their permission, talked to the lender about their particular situation and, how they were both super qualified to make this work. But at some point in the process, the lender that they were working with, who was not someone who was very sensitive to their needs or to our community at all, started calling them and asking them if there was just like any way that their parents could give them more money toward their home to restructure things. And they ended up suspending their transaction over it and having to take a break because the details were such that the parents were being cared for by this couple and they had had a very complicated split family history, et cetera. And it's like, it's so frustrating when you're the realtor and you're really trying to look out for your clients. You also have to be very careful about what you can and cannot disclose because you're protecting them and it's their business, whether they choose to disclose or not. But again, it's like, it has definitely changed who I will and will not work with, because when I say to someone on the finance end of things, like, this is where we are, there is no family help, like, I need you to respect these boundaries. I know in some circumstances, it's like you can maybe push the parents into a little bit more here and there, but in some cases you cannot, and it can actually be extremely re-traumatizing for clients. So again, just, it's just having a different lens of like how you approach a client. And I mean, in an ideal world, I think we would approach every client like this, right? Like Percy, a 45-minute sit down conversation about a mortgage, I feel like should be the industry standard, but people are coming from different backgrounds. And so one of the things that comes up a lot for me is pronouns. I have my pronouns on my email signature. I introduce myself with my pronouns. It's not because I particularly want you to use one or the other. For me, it's much more of an indicator of, if you would like to tell me yours, I'm starting the conversation by saying, these are mine. which means that I don't often have to ask the question, what are your pronouns? Because it comes up when I introduce myself. Also, it's a visual indicator in my email signature that this is a discussion I'm open to having. And again, you know, I'm in my own journey as an individual. So I have she and they, and, you know, a lot of people will use that as a conversation starter with me, which I think is a great tool too, which is, you know, like, why don't you have one? Are you a they or are you she? And I'm like, well, you know, I don't know. You can call me a she, you can call me a they. I'm on my own journey, but it's there, right? And so again, it's like a lot of people think, well, I look like a woman, or I present as a woman, or I look like a man. No one's ever going to confuse me for being anything else. Why would I include my pronouns? Well, because it's not for you, it's for other people to realize that you're a safe resource for them to be able to disclose if they choose to, that, you know, their pronouns may not be as obvious. So again, just like how you're interacting with clients, a lot of times it isn't about you, it's about extending these bridges to someone who's coming from a fear-based state, someone who is coming from a lot of discrimination, where they're not automatically assuming that you're going to be helpful, and where maybe someone in a similar position to you that you have held in their life has been actually traumatic for them in some way, if that makes sense. Also, Lorna, I see that you are in a rural area. I feel you. One of the reasons why we are the Oregon Alliance is because we really do want to have this conversation in small towns across Oregon and not just in bigger metro areas. I also live in a place where it's relatively small. We are having our very first Pride celebration on Saturday. I get it. I really do. And I still think that you'd be surprised who is in your community, because it takes a lot to live in a smaller place and live in an openly out way. And so I'm sure that there are people in your community too. We just have to, you know, do a little bit of extra work to find them and let them know that we would like to do business with them because they're safe with us.
Yeah, and that's part of what we're
job.
talking about is that, you know, how do you convey yourself as a person who can be trusted for people to feel safe enough to come to you, because people are living everywhere, right? There's a lot of rural LGBTQ folks, and
Absolutely.
it's you know, things like putting some signs, you know, in your email signatures, like Alexa's talking about, whether it's your pronouns, or maybe, you know, some people like to put quotes that can show that you're more easily approachable. We have our Alliance logo in our email signatures now. There's also going to be an ally. So if you're not a member of the LGBTQ community, you're most welcome, you know, you're most welcome and as an ally. And we're going to be having a training sometime within the next year for how to be a better ally. And you can go through a process of getting certified, and then you can have your own ally symbol that you can add to your email signature. It can be as simple as doing things like adding a welcoming sign to your brokerage door, you know, somewhere that people will see, or maybe in your background of your office, things to convey that you are a place of safety. I think one of the things I want to mention is that you always want to follow your client's lead, right?
Yes.
If you are working, for instance, with a trans person or a same-sex couple, you always want to allow your client to set the tone. We want to be careful not to out our clients to other professionals or to members of their own family. You want to ask your clients what pronouns they would like you to use with other people. Make sure that they want you to correct other people. If, let's say an example is, okay, you have a trans client that goes by she, her pronouns. Maybe the inspector is going to come over, you know, to inspect the home. And would you like, you know, would your client like you to correct the inspector if the inspector uses the wrong pronouns, or does your client just prefer you just to let them handle that, right? So don't make assumptions on behalf of your client, because everybody is different, right? I've had clients who, in some contexts are going by she, her, in other contexts going by they, them. So you just really want to check in and let the client set the tone for you. I think in terms of, building and fostering inclusion, it's like Alexa and I and Ashley have the ability to reach people who are in our spheres and willing to listen to us, right? And so sometimes the folks who are listening to us have the ability to reach other spheres and to connect with other people who are willing to listen to you, right? And we have ways that we convey information differently, and we have different trust relationships within our communities, right? So it's almost like a relay race where we get to pass the baton to one another. If you're out in your communities and you hear something that you find is offensive, you can address that in a way that feels right for you. You don't have to do it the way I would or the way Alexa would. Like, you can have those conversations in the way that feel right to you. And I think that's the way that we can foster a more inclusive society, because I think a lot of times people are afraid of us and me because they don't know anything about me, right? They have this picture that's presented to them in the media, and they don't need me, they need you to go talk to them. And so if you can do that, that's a way that you can help. And you can play the role that's right for you. You can support LGBTQ causes in your communities. You can give time, if you have it, to the diversity committee, right? Or you can join the Real Estate Alliance. You can build a diverse network, as Alexa was talking about, of people that you're working with, and make sure that you have a diverse network so that when you have diverse clients, they get to work with people who are going to be safe for them, right? And my feeling about when I'm doing transactions is that, sometimes I hear people say, like, I'm not going to do that deal because it's too difficult, right? Or that's going to take too much work. And my feeling about that is that sometimes I have deals that are like super easy, right? Sometimes I have higher commission, things are fast, it's simple. And sometimes I have things that are hard, that have unforeseeable complexities. And my goal is to have those things kind of balance out. I'm not always looking for easy, and I'm not always looking for hard. I'm just like, when things get hard, I think, well, this one's harder, but I just had that other one that was super easy. So that's a way that I can feel better about helping folks who need extra handholding or need extra explanations.
And even just a simple thing, I know it sounds like I'm just plugging the Alliance here, but it's been kind of like amazing for me. It's like you have this national network of other people in this group, and everybody wants referrals, right? And I've given and taken referrals from people all across the country who are part of the Alliance. And again, it's not like all we talk about is queer issues all the time, 24/7. A lot of times we're just talking about our industry and things like that. But knowing that we share the same values, that we're part of the same group when I'm networking is probably going to make me refer to one person versus another. And so even just in that way, like being part of an organization where your mission and your values are aligned, you know that you're dealing with someone who's going to see things through a similar lens to you is really valuable. And again, those people are all in a membership directory. You get to look them up, you get to see who they are, et cetera. So you get to know them. made sure that my ex-husband, when he retired to Florida, had an Alliance realtor. I'm now really good friends with that person and seeing them at the national conference later this year. So we've had like a 2-year relationship that we've built through just that one referral. And again, you know, it's like, you see things in this different way, but you also have access to all of these resources. We also have with the Alliance this thing that they just rolled out called LGBTQ homes.com, which allows people all over the country to look up who is part of this network, who would safely help them in their community. And again, it doesn't matter if you're an ally or part of the community, you get to be on that as someone who is open to helping LGBTQ plus people find homes. And so, you know, there are so many different ways in which you can be a resource and be valuable to us and to clients. So I would really consider getting involved with, you know, Oregon Realtors, PMAR, whatever you want to get involved with in terms of policy, but also referral and networking groups that are aligned with your values, which hopefully are like ours.
Yeah, and I just also wanted to add, you know, there was a new report that came out the other day. There's an institute at UCLA.
The Williams Institute.
It's called the Williams Institute. And what they do is they take demographic and popular research about the LGBTQ community. And, you know, there's so much fear out there, and we've talked about a lot of very difficult things today. But the research actually shows that most adults in the US, they oppose discrimination, okay? Most people in the US really are good, kind people who oppose discrimination. So well over 70% of adults oppose denying business services to LGBTQ people. Over 74% of adults oppose denying employment to LGBTQ people based on religious beliefs. And 84% of adults oppose denying health care to LGBTQ people based on religious beliefs. It also showed that 2/3 of Catholics and Protestants oppose using religious beliefs to discriminate against LGBTQ people. So that's kind of what I mean when I'm saying we need to do a better job of talking to one another and to our communities, because I really believe that once we make those connections, we're all in this human experience together, right? So that's how I choose to approach my walk through this world.
I agree with that, Percy. I think when you lean into your humanity and you are open to having conversations with people, a lot of times the worst of the fear can be assuaged when you start to build that sort of community, and also when you start to realize that there are a lot of people out there who are willing to listen and grow and understand, and you don't have to keep yourself all bundled up inside.
Awesome. Okay, I think you covered all the questions that we had. We just kind of like ran through them and ran them all together, which is great. Somebody said, is the Alliance logo available to members? I want to include it on my public facing platform.
Is.
Yeah, so when you sign up, and by the way, I'm the membership director for
also you should tell them about the code.
That's my new role. So if you have any questions about Alliance membership, I'm your go-to person for that. And what happens is as soon as you sign up for your membership, they will send you those logos in the right definition that you're then authorized to use. You can't use it without being a member. And they will also help you create your marketing profile on the websites, on the LGBTQ plus homes and the regular Alliance website. And we have a $50 off promo. Alexa's pinging. We have a $50 off promo for June. We sent this out, I think, through the OAR listserv, but we can also send you that QR code. I think it might actually be in the announcement for this webinar. There's a QR code to give you $50 off for June of the membership, annual membership.
Or you could just use the 2023 Pride 50.
Is there a link for membership? Katie can probably pull that really quick, but I think you get it all through the Oregon Realtors website.
LGBTQ Alliance.org, I believe, is the website.
Cool. I wanted to add one thing in talking about, we were talking about how we talk to our clients and letting them lead on pronouns and how they want that addressed and everything. I've been really trying, when I talk about my clients, always I use they and them. When I'm talking to other people involved in a transaction, I don't need to call and say, hey, I've got a client, she's a single lady, and they don't need to know that. And to protect fair housing and everything, I mean, they're probably going to figure that out when I send over the offer, but they don't need to know if it's one person, two people, five people buying the house. I just say they, I've got clients and they are in this situation. This is their situation. When I talk to other people outside of the transaction. So just use they and them all the time. Unless somebody tells you differently, that's pretty safe. And that way you're not divulging information that unfortunately people do discriminate. I think if you're on this call, you probably know that. And so to kind of avoid that, if you just go at it with saying they, then there's no discrimination up front, hopefully. Still working on the ally training. Oh yeah. It's not scheduled yet. It's on the docket for the next year or so.
That's correct. We haven't scheduled that yet. Yeah, it does look like we're right at the top of the hour. So I would just say, if you have questions, need help with the client in terms of what to do, what not to do, you're always welcome to reach out to me with that spirit.
Yep, and I'm happy to help too.
Okay, well, thank you, Percy and Alexa, for being on, and everybody for being on the call. We had a really good turnout, so thank you. And as we mentioned at the beginning, it'll be within the next 2 weeks. Everybody should get their CE. So
thank you all
what
for
was the
joining
website
us.
again? LGBTQhomes.com. Was that it?
Realestatealliance.org.
No, they were looking for the one where they can sign up as a safe person.
So that comes with membership. Once you're a member, it'll auto feed you into that.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you.